This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 43 in Bareilly and Dehra jails. After 6 weeks in Naini prison, I was transferred to the Bareilly district jail. I was again keeping indifferent health, and much to my annoyance, I used to get a daily rise in temperature. After 4 months spent in Bareilly, when the summer temperature was almost at its highest, I was again transferred, this time to a cooler place, Dehra jail, at the foot of the Himalayas. There I remained, without a break, for 14.5 months, almost to the end of my 2-year term. News reached me, of course, from interviews and letters and selected newspapers, but I was wholly out of touch with much that was happening and had only a hazy notion of the principal events. When I was discharged, I was kept busy with personal affairs as well as the political situation as I found it then. After a little more than 5 months of freedom, I was brought back to prison, and here I am still. Thus, during the last 3 years, I have been mostly in prison and out of touch with events, and I have had little opportunity of making myself acquainted in any detail with all that has happened during this period. I have still the vaguest of knowledge as to what took place behind the scenes at the second Round Table Conference, which was attended by Gandhiji. I have had no chance so far of a talk with him on this subject, nor of discussing with him or others much that has happened since. I do not know enough of those years 1932 and 1933 to trace the development of our national struggle. But I knew the stage and the background well, and the actors also, and had an instinctive appreciation of many a little thing that happened. I could thus form a fair notion of the general course of the struggle. For the first 4 months or so, civil disobedience functioned strongly and aggressively, and then there was a gradual decline with occasional bursts. A direct action struggle can only remain at a revolutionary pitch for a very short time. It cannot remain static, it has to go up or down. Civil disobedience after the first flush went down slowly, but it could carry on at a lower level for long periods. In spite of outlawry, the All India Congress organization continued to function with a fair measure of success. It kept in touch with its provincial workers, sent instructions, received reports, occasionally gave financial assistance. The provincial organizations also continued with more or less success. I do not know much about other provinces during those years when I was in prison, but I gathered some information about UP activities after my release. The UP Congress office functioned regularly right through 1932 until the middle of 1933, when civil disobedience was first suspended by the then acting Congress President on the advice of Gandhiji. During this period, frequent directions were sent to districts, printed or cyclo-styled bulletins issued regularly, district work inspected from time to time, and our national service workers paid their allowances. Much of this work was necessarily secret work, but the secretary of the provincial committee in charge of the office, etc., was always working as such, publicly, till he was arrested and removed, and another took his place. Our experience of 1930 and 1932 showed that it was easily possible for us to organize a secret network of information all over India. Without much effort, and in spite of some opposition, good results were produced. But many of us had the feeling that secrecy did not fit in with the spirit of civil disobedience, and produced a damping effect on the mass consciousness. As a small part of a big open mass movement it was useful, but there was always the danger, especially when the movement was declining, of a few more or less ineffective secret activities taking the place of the mass movement. Gandhiji condemned all secrecy in July 1933. Agrarian no-tax movements flourished for some time in Gujarat and the Karnataka, apart from the UP. In both Gujarat and Karnataka, there were peasant proprietors who refused to pay their revenue to the government and suffered greatly because of this. Some effort, necessarily inadequate, was made on behalf of the Congress to help the sufferers and relieve the misery caused by the ejectments and confiscation of property. In the UP, no effort to help the dispossessed tenantry in this way was made by the Provincial Congress. The problem here was a much vaster one. Tenants are far more numerous than peasant proprietors, the area was much bigger, and the provincial resources were very limited. It was quite impossible for us to help scores of thousands who had suffered because of the campaign, and equally difficult for us to draw a line between them and the vast numbers who were always on the starvation line. To help a few thousands only would have led to trouble and bad blood. So we decided not to give financial assistance, and we broadcasted this fact right at the beginning, and our position was thoroughly appreciated by the peasantry. It was wonderful how much they put up with without complaint or murmur. Of course, we tried to help individuals where we could, especially the wives and children of workers who went to prison. Such is the poverty of this unhappy country that even 1 rupee per month was a godsend. Right through this period, the UP Provincial Committee, which was of course a proscribed body, continued to pay the usual meagre allowances to its paid workers, and if they went to prison, as all of them did in turn, to support their families. This was a major item in its budget. Then came the charge for printing and duplicating leaflets and bulletins. This also was a heavy charge. Travelling expenses formed another principal item, and some grants had to be given to the less prosperous districts. In spite of all these and other expenses during a period of intensive mass struggle against a powerful and entrenched government, the total expenditure of the UP Provincial Committee for 20 months from January 1932 to the end of August 1933 were about rupees 63,000, that is, about rupees 3,140 per month. This figure does not include the separate expenditure of some of the strong and more prosperous district committees like Allahabad, Agra, Kanpur, Lucknow. As a province, the UP kept in the very forefront of the struggle right through 1931 and 1933, and I think, considering the results obtained, it is remarkable how little it spent. It would be interesting to compare with this modest figure the provincial government's special expenditure to crush civil disobedience. I imagine, though I have no knowledge, that some of the other major Congress provinces spent much more. But Bihar was from the Congress viewpoint an even poorer province than its neighbour, the UP, and yet its part in the struggle was a splendid one. So gradually, the civil disobedience movement declined, but still it carried on, not without distinction. Progressively, it ceased to be a mass movement. Apart from the severity of government repression, the first severe blow to it came in September 1932 when Gandhiji fasted for the first time on the Harijan issue. That fast roused mass consciousness, but it directed it in another direction. Civil disobedience was finally killed for all practical purposes by the suspension of it in May 1933. It continued after that, more in theory than in practice. It is no doubt true that even without that suspension, it would have gradually petered out. India was numbed by the violence and harshness of repression. The nervous energy of the nation as a whole was for the moment exhausted, and it was not being recharged. Individually, there were still many who could carry on civil resistance, but they functioned in a somewhat artificial atmosphere. It was not pleasant for us in prison to learn of this slow decay of a great movement, and yet very few of us had expected a flashing success. There was always an odd chance that something flashing might happen if there was an irrepressible upheaval of the masses. But that was not to be counted upon, and so we looked forward to a long struggle with ups and downs, and many a stalemate in between, and a progressive strengthening of the masses in discipline and united action and ideology. Sometimes in those early days of 1932, I almost feared a quick and spectacular success, for this seemed to lead inevitably to a compromise leaving the governmentarians opportunists at the top. The experience of 1931 had been revealing. Success to be worthwhile should come when the people generally were strong enough and clear enough in their ideas to take advantage of it. Otherwise, the masses would fight and sacrifice, and at the psychological moment, others would step in gracefully and gather the spoils. There was grave danger of this, because in the Congress itself there was a great deal of loose thinking and no clear ideas as to what system of government or society we were driving at. Some congressmen, indeed, did not think of changing the existing system of government much, but simply of replacing the British or alien element in it by the Swadeshi brand. The governmentarians of the pure variety did not matter much, for their first article of faith was subservience to the state authority, whatever it was. But even the liberals and responsivists accepted the ideology of the British government almost completely, and their occasional criticism, such as it was thus wholly ineffective and valueless. It was well known that they were legalists at any price, and as such they could not welcome civil resistance. But they went much further and more or less ranged themselves on the side of the government. They were almost silent and rather frightened spectators of the complete suppression of civil liberties of all kinds. It was not merely a question of civil disobedience being countered and suppressed by the government, but of all political life and public activity being stopped, and hardly a voice was raised against this. Those who usually stood for these liberties were involved in the struggle itself, and they took the penalties for refusing to submit to the state's coercion. Others were cowed into abject submission and hardly raised their voices in criticism. Mild criticism, when it was indulged in, was apologetic in tone and was accompanied by strong denunciation of the Congress and those who were carrying on the struggle. In Western countries a strong public opinion has been built up in favor of civil liberties, and any limitation of them is resented and opposed. Perhaps this is past history now. There are large numbers of people who, though not prepared to participate in strong and direct action themselves, care enough for the liberty of speech and writing, assembly and organization, person and press, to agitate for them ceaselessly, and thus help to check the tendency of the state to encroach upon them. The Indian liberals claim to some extent to carry on the traditions of British liberalism, although they have nothing in common with them except the name, and might have been expected to put up some intellectual opposition to the suppression of these liberties, for they suffered from this also, but they played no such part. It was not for them to say with Voltaire, "I disagree absolutely with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." It is not perhaps fair to blame them for this, for they have never stood out as the champions of democracy or liberty, and they had to face a situation in which a loose word might have got them into trouble. It is more pertinent to observe the reactions of those ardent lovers of liberty, the British Liberals, and the new socialists of the British Labour Party to repression in India. They managed to contemplate the Indian scene with a certain measure of equanimity, painful as it was, and sometimes their satisfaction at the success of the scientific application of repression, as a correspondent of the Manchester Guardian put it, was evident. Recently, the national government of Great Britain has sought to pass a sedition bill, and a great deal of criticism has been directed to it, especially from Liberals and Labourites on the ground, inter alia, that it restricts free speech and gives magistrates the right of issuing warrants for searches. Whenever I read this criticism I sympathized with it, and I had at the same time the picture of India before me, where the actual laws in force today are approximately 100 times worse than the British Sedition Bill seeks to enact. I wondered how it was that Britishers who strain at a gnat in England could swallow a camel in India without turning a hair. Indeed, I have always wondered at and admired the astonishing knack of the British people of making their moral standards correspond with their material interests and of seeing virtue in everything that advances their imperial designs. Mussolini and Hitler are condemned by them in perfect good faith and with righteous indignation for their attacks on liberty and democracy. And, in equal good faith, similar attacks and deprivation of liberty in India seem to them as necessary, and the highest moral reasons are advanced to show that true disinterested behavior on their part demands them. While fire raged all over India and men's and women's souls were put to the test, far away in London the chosen ones foregathered to draw up a constitution for India. There was the Third Round Table Conference in 1932 and numerous committees, and large numbers of members of the Legislative Assembly angled for membership of these committees so that they might thus combine public duty with private pleasure. Quite a crowd went at the public expense. Later, in 1933, came the Joint Committee with its Indian assessors, and again free passages were provided by a benevolent government to those who went as witnesses. Many people crossed the seas again at public cost in their earnest desire to serve India, and some, it was stated, even haggled for more passage money. It was not surprising to see these representatives of vested interests, frightened by the mass movements of India in action, gathering together in London under the aegis of British imperialism. But it hurt the nationalism in us to see any Indian behave in this way when the mother country was involved in a life and death struggle. And yet from one point of view it seemed to many of us a good thing, for it separated once and for all, as we thought, wrongly, it now appears, the reactionary from the progressive elements in India. This sifting would help in the political education of the masses and make it clearer still to all concerned that only through independence could we hope to face social issues and raise the burdens from the masses. But it was surprising to find how far these people had alienated themselves, not only in their day-to-day lives, but morally and mentally from the Indian masses. There were no links with them, no understanding of them or of that inner urge which was driving them to sacrifice and suffering. Reality for these distinguished statesmen consisted of one thing: British imperial power, which could not be successfully challenged and therefore should be accepted with good or bad grace. It did not seem to strike them that it was quite impossible for them to solve India's problem or draw up a real live constitution without the goodwill of the masses. Mr. J. A. Spender, in his recent short history of our times, refers to the failure of the Irish Joint Conference of 1910, which sought to end the constitutional crisis. He says that the political leaders who were trying to find a constitution in the midst of a crisis were like men trying to ensure a house when it is on fire. The fire in India in 1932 and 1933 was far greater than in Ireland in 1910, and even though the flames die down, the burning embers will remain for a long time, hot and unquenchable as India's will to freedom. In India, there was an amazing growth of the spirit of violence in official circles. The tradition was an old one, and the country had been governed by the British mainly as a police state. The overriding outlook even of the civilian ruler had been military. There was always a touch of a hostile army occupying alien and conquered soil. This mentality grew because of the serious challenge to the existing order. The occasional acts of terrorism in Bengal or elsewhere fed this official violence and gave it some justification for its own acts. The various ordinances and the government policy gave such tremendous power to the executive and the police that in effect India was under police Raj and there were hardly any checks. To a greater or less degree, all the provinces of India went through this fire of fierce repression, but the frontier province and Bengal suffered most. The frontier province had always been a predominantly military area, administered under semi-military regulations. Its strategic position was important, and the Red Shirt movement had thoroughly upset the government. Military columns were very much in evidence in the pacification of the province and in dealing with recalcitrant villages. It was a common practice all over India to impose heavy collective fines on villages, and occasionally, in Bengal especially, on towns. Punitive police were often stationed, and police excesses were inevitable when they had enormous powers and no checks. We had typical instances of the lawlessness and disorderliness of law and order. Parts of Bengal presented the most extraordinary spectacle. Government treated the whole populations, or to be exact, the Hindu population, as hostile, and everyone, man, woman, boy or girl between 12 and 25, had to carry identity cards. There were externments and internments in the mass. dress was regulated, schools were regulated or closed, bicycles were not allowed, movements had to be reported to the police, curfew, sunset law, military marches, punitive police, collective fines, and a host of other rules and regulations. Large areas seemed to be in a continuous state of siege, and the inhabitants were little better than ticket-of-leave men and women under the strictest surveillance. Whether from the point of view of the British government all these amazing provisions and regulations were necessary or not, it is not for me to judge. If they were not necessary, then that government must be held guilty of a grave offence in oppressing and humiliating and causing great loss to the populations of whole areas. If they were necessary, then surely that is the final verdict on British rule in India. The spirit of violence pursued our people even within the jails. The class division of prisoners was a farce, and often a torture for those who were put in an upper class. Very few went to these upper classes, and many a sensitive man and woman had to submit to conditions which were a continuing agony. The deliberate policy of government seems to have been to make the lot of political prisoners worse than that of ordinary convicts. An Inspector General of Prisons went to the length of issuing a confidential circular to all the prisons, pointing out that civil disobedience prisoners must be dealt with grimly. Footnote: This circular was dated June 30th, 1932, and it contained the following. The Inspector General impresses upon superintendents and jail subordinates the fact that there is no justification for preferential treatment in favor of civil disobedience movement prisoners as such. This class required to be kept in their places and dealt with grimly. End of footnote. Whipping became a frequent jail punishment. On April 27, 1933, the Under-Secretary for India stated in the House of Commons that Sir Samuel Hoare was aware that over 500 persons in India were whipped during 1932 for offences in connection with the civil disobedience movement. It is not clear if this figure includes the many whippings in prisons for breaches of jail discipline. As news of frequent whippings came to us in prison in 1932, I remembered our protest and our 3-day fast in December 1930 against one or two odd instances of whipping. I had felt shocked then at the brutality of it, and now I was still shocked, and there was a dull pain inside me, but it did not strike me that I should protest and fast again. I felt much more helpless in the matter. The mind gets blunted to brutality after a while. A bad thing has only to continue for long for the world to get used to it. The hardest of labor was given to our men in prison, mills, oil presses, etc., and their lot was made as unbearable as possible in order to induce them to apologize and be released on an undertaking being given to government. That was considered a great triumph for the jail authorities. Most of these jail punishments fell to the lot of boys and young men, who resented coercion and humiliation. A fine and spirited lot of boys they were, full of self-respect and pep and the spirit of adventure, the kind that in an English public school or university would have received every encouragement and praise. Here in India, their youthful idealism and pride led them to fetters and solitary confinement and whipping. The lot of our womenfolk in prison was especially hard and painful to contemplate. They were mostly middle-class women, accustomed to a sheltered life, and suffering chiefly from the many repressions and customs produced by a society dominated to his own advantage by man. The call of freedom had always a double meaning for them, and the enthusiasm and energy with which they threw themselves into the struggle had no doubt their springs in the vague and hardly conscious, but nevertheless intense, desire to rid themselves of domestic slavery also. Excepting a very few, they were classed as ordinary prisoners and placed with the most degraded of companions, and often under horrid conditions. I was once lodged in a barrack next to a female enclosure, a wall separating us. In that enclosure there were, besides other convicts, some women political prisoners, including one who had been my hostess and in whose house I had once stayed. A high wall separated us, but it did not prevent me from listening in horror to the language and curses which our friends had to put up with from the women convict warders. It was very noticeable that the treatment of political prisoners in 1932 and 1933 was worse than it had been 2 years earlier, in 1930. This could not have been due merely to the whims of individual officers, and the only reasonable inference seems to be that this was the deliberate policy of the government. Even apart from political prisoners, the United Provinces Jail Department had had the reputation in those years of being very much against anything that might savour of humanity. We had an interesting instance of this from an unimpeachable source. A distinguished jail visitor, a gallant knight, not a rebel and a sedition-monger like us, but one whom the government had delighted to honour, paid us a visit once in prison. He told us that some months earlier he had visited another jail, and in his inspection note had described the jailer as a humane disciplinarian. The jailer in question begged him not to say anything about his humanity, as this was at a discount in official circles, but the knight insisted, as he could not conceive that any harm would befall the jailer because of his description. Result, soon after the jailer was transferred to a distant and out-of-the-way place, which was in the nature of a punishment to him. Some jailers, who were considered to be particularly fierce and unscrupulous, were promoted and given titles. Graft is such a universal phenomenon in jails that hardly anyone keeps clear of it. But my own experience, and that of many of my friends, has been that the worst offenders among the jail staff are usually those who pose as strict disciplinarians. I have been fortunate in jail and outside, and almost every one I have come across has given me courtesy and consideration, even when perhaps I did not deserve them. One incident in jail, however, caused me and my people much pain. My mother, Kamala, and Indira, my daughter, had gone to interview my brother-in-law, Ranjit Pandit, in the Allahabad district jail, and, for no fault of theirs, they were insulted and hustled out by the jailer. I was grieved when I learnt of this, and the reaction of the provincial government to it shocked me. To avoid the possibility of my mother being insulted by jail officials, I decided to give up all interviews. For nearly 7 months, while I was in Dehradun jail, I had no interview. End of Chapter 43. Chapter 44. Prison Humours. 2 of us were transferred together from the Bareilly district jail to the Dehradun jail, Govind Ballabh Pant and I. To avoid the possibility of a demonstration, we were not put on the train at Bareilly, but at a wayside station 50 miles out. We were taken secretly by motor car at night, and after many months of seclusion, that drive through the cool night air was a rare delight. Before we left Bareilly jail, a little incident took place which moved me then, and is yet fresh in my memory. The superintendent of police of Bareilly, an Englishman, was present there, and as I got into the car, he handed to me rather shyly a packet, which he told me contained old German illustrated magazines. He said that he had heard that I was learning German, and so he had brought these magazines for me. I had never met him before, nor have I seen him since. I do not even know his name. This spontaneous act of courtesy and the kindly thought that prompted it touched me, and I felt very grateful to him. During that long midnight drive I mused over the relations of Englishmen and Indians, of ruler and ruled, of official and non-official, of those in authority and those who have to obey. What a great gulf divided the two races, and how they distrusted and disliked each other. But more than the distrust and the dislike was the ignorance of each other, and because of this, each side was a little afraid of the other, and was constantly on its guard in the other's presence. To each the other appeared as a sour-looking, unamiable creature, and neither realized that there was decency and kindliness behind the mask. As the rulers of the land, with enormous patronage at their command, the English had attracted to themselves crowds of cringing place-hunters and opportunists, and they judged of India from these unsavory specimens. The Indian saw the Englishman function only as an official, with all the inhumanity of the machine, and with all the passion of a vested interest, trying to preserve itself. How different was the behavior of a person acting as an individual and obeying his own impulses from his behavior as an official or a unit in an army. The soldier, stiffening to attention, drops his humanity, and acting as an automaton, shoots and kills inoffensive and harmless persons who have done him no ill. So also, I thought, the police officer who would hesitate to do an unkindness to an individual would, the day after, direct a lathi charge on innocent people. He would not think of himself as an individual then, nor will he consider as individuals those crowds whom he beats down or shoots. As soon as one begins to think of the other side as a mass or a crowd, the human link seems to go. We forget that crowds also consist of individuals, of men and women and children who love and hate and suffer. An average Englishman, if he was frank, would probably confess that he knows some quite decent Indians, but they are exceptions, and as a whole Indians are a detestable crowd. The average Indian would admit that some Englishmen whom he knows were admirable, but, apart from these few, the English were an overbearing, brutal, and thoroughly bad lot. Curious how each person judges of the other race, not from the individual with whom he has come in contact, but from others about whom he knows very little or nothing at all. Personally, I have been very fortunate, and almost invariably I have received courtesy from my own countrymen as well as from the English. Even my jailers and the policemen who have arrested me or escorted me as a prisoner from place to place have been kind to me, and much of the bitterness of conflict and the sting of jail life has been toned down because of this human touch. It was not surprising that my own countrymen should treat me so, for I had gained a measure of notoriety and popularity among them. Even for Englishmen I was an individual, and not merely one of the mass, and, I imagine, the fact that I had received my education in England, and especially my having been to an English public school, brought me nearer to them. Because of this, they could not help considering me as more or less civilized after their own pattern, however perverted my public activities appeared to be. Often I felt a little embarrassed and humiliated because of this special treatment when I compared my lot with that of most of my colleagues. Despite all these advantages that I had, jail was jail, and the oppressive atmosphere of the place was sometimes almost unbearable. The very air of it was full of violence and meanness and graft and untruth. There was either cringing or cursing. A person who was at all sensitive was in a continuous state of tension. Trivial occurrences would upset one. A piece of bad news in a letter, some item in the newspaper, would make one almost ill with anxiety or anger for a while. Outside there was always relief in action, and various interests and activities produced an equilibrium of the mind and body. In prison there was no outlet, and one felt bottled up and repressed, and inevitably one took one-sided and rather distorted views of happenings. Illness in jail was particularly distressing, and yet I managed to accustom myself to the jail routine, and with physical exercise and fairly hard mental work kept fit. Whatever the value of work and exercise might be outside, they are essential in jail, for without them one is apt to go to pieces. I adhered to a strict timetable and, in order to keep up to the mark, I carried on with as many normal habits as I could, such as the daily shave. I was allowed a safety razor. I mention this minor matter because, as a rule, people gave it up and slacked in other ways. After a hard day's work, the evening found me pleasantly tired and sleep was welcomed. And so the days passed, and the weeks, and the months. But sometimes a month would stick terribly and would not end, or so it seemed. And sometimes I would feel bored and fed up and angry with almost everything and everybody, with my companions in prison, with the jail staff, with people outside for something they had done or not done, with the British Empire, but this was a permanent feeling, and above all with myself. I would become a bundle of nerves, very susceptible to various humours caused by jail life. Fortunately, I recovered soon from these humours. Interview days were the red-letter days in jail. How one longed for them, and waited for them, and counted the days. And after the excitement of the interview, there was the inevitable reaction, and a sense of emptiness and loneliness. If, as sometimes happened, the interview was not a success, because of some bad news which upset me, or some other reason, I would feel miserable afterwards. There were jail officials present, of course, at the interviews, but 2 or 3 times at Bareilly there was in addition a CID man present with paper and pencil, eagerly taking down almost every word of the conversation. I found this exceedingly irritating, and these interviews were complete failures. And then I gave up these precious interviews because of the treatment my mother and wife had received in the course of an interview in the Allahabad jail and afterwards from the government. For nearly 7 months I had no interview. It was a dreary time for me, and when at the end of that period I decided to resume interviews and my people came to see me, I was almost intoxicated with the joy of it. My sister's little children also came to see me, and when a tiny one wanted to mount on my shoulder, as she used to do, it was more than my emotions could stand. That touch of home life, after the long yearning for human contacts, upset me. When interviews snapped, the fortnightly letters from home or from some other jail, for both my sisters were in prison, became all the more precious and eagerly expected. If the letter did not come on the appointed day, I was worried. And yet, when it did come, I almost hesitated to open it. I played about with it as one does with an assured pleasure, and at the back of my mind there was also a trace of fear lest the letter contain any news or reference which might annoy me. Letter writing and receiving in jail were always serious incursions on a peaceful and unruffled existence. They produced an emotional state which was disturbing, and for a day or 2 afterwards one's mind wandered, and it was difficult to concentrate on the day's work. In Naini prison and Bareilly jail I had several companions. In Dehra there were 3 of us to begin with, Govind, Ballapant, Kunwar Anand Singh of Kashipur and I. But Pantji was discharged after a couple of months on the expiry of his 6 months. 2 others joined us later. By the beginning of January 1933, all my companions had left me and I was alone. For nearly 8 months, till my discharge at the end of August, I lived a solitary life in Dehradun jail with hardly anyone to talk to, except some member of the jail staff for a few minutes daily. This was not technically solitary confinement, but it was a near approach to it, and it was a dreary period for me. Fortunately, I had resumed my interviews, and they brought some relief. As a special favor, I suppose, I was allowed to receive fresh flowers from outside and to keep a few photographs, and they cheered me greatly. Ordinarily, flowers and photographs are not permitted, and on several occasions I have not been allowed to receive the flowers that had been sent for me. Attempts to brighten up the cells were not encouraged, and I remember a superintendent of a jail once objecting to the manner in which a companion of mine, whose cell was next to mine, had arranged his toilet articles. He was told that he must not make his cell look attractive and luxurious. The articles of luxury were a toothbrush, toothpaste, fountain pen ink, a bottle of hair oil, a brush and comb, and perhaps 1 or 2 other little things. One begins to appreciate the value of the little things of life in prison. One's belongings are so few and they cannot easily be added to or replaced, and one clings to them and gathers up odd bits of things which in the world outside would go to the waste paper basket. The property sense does not leave one even when there is nothing worthwhile to own and keep. Sometimes a physical longing would come for the soft things of life: bodily comfort, pleasant surroundings, the company of friends, interesting conversation, games with children. A picture or a paragraph in a newspaper would bring the old days vividly before one, carefree days of youth, and a nostalgia would seize one, and the day would be passed in restlessness. I used to spin a little daily, for I found some manual occupation soothing and a relief from too much intellectual work. My main occupation, however, was reading and writing. I could not have all the books I wanted, as there were restrictions and a censorship, and the censors were not always very competent for the job. Spengler's Decline of the West was held up because the title looked dangerous and seditious. But I must not complain, for I had on the whole a goodly variety of books. Again I seemed to have been a favoured person, and many of my colleagues, class prisoners, had the greatest difficulty in getting books on current topics. In Benares jail, I was told, even the official white paper containing the British government's constitutional proposals was not allowed in, as it dealt with political matters. The only books that British officials heartily recommended were religious books or novels. It is wonderful how dear to the heart of the British government is the subject of religion, and how impartially it encourages all brands of it. When the most ordinary civil liberties have been curtailed in India, it is hardly pertinent to talk of a prisoner's rights. And yet the subject is worthy of consideration. If a court of law sentences a person to imprisonment, does it follow that not only his body but also his mind should be incarcerated? Why should not the minds of prisoners be free, even though their bodies are not? Those in charge of the prison administrations in India will no doubt be horrified at such a question, for their capacity for new ideas and sustained thought is usually limited. Censorship is bad enough at any time, and is partisan and stupid. In India, it deprives us of a great deal of modern literature and advanced journals and newspapers. The list of proscribed books is extensive and is frequently added to. To add to all this, the prisoner has to suffer a second and a separate censorship, and thus many books and newspapers that can be legally purchased and read outside the prison may not reach him. Some time ago this question arose in the United States, in the famous Sing Sing prison of New York, where some communist newspapers had been banned. The feeling against communists is very strong among the ruling classes in America, but in spite of this, the prison authorities agreed that the inmates of the prison could receive any publication which they desired, including communist newspapers and magazines. The sole exception made by the warden was in the case of cartoons which he regarded as inflammatory. It is a little absurd to discuss this question of freedom of mind in prison in India, when, as it happens, the vast majority of the prisoners are not allowed any newspapers or writing materials. It is not a question of censorship, but of total denial. Only A-class, or in Bengal Division 1, prisoners are allowed writing materials as a matter of course, and not even all these are allowed daily newspapers. The daily newspaper allowed is of the government's choice. B and C class prisoners, politicals and non-politicals, are not supposed to have writing materials. The former may sometimes get them as a very special privilege, which is frequently withdrawn. Probably the proportion of a class prisoners to the others is 1 to 1,000, and they might well be excluded in considering the lot of prisoners in India. But it is well to remember that even these favored A-class convicts have far less privileges in regard to books and newspapers than the ordinary prisoners in most civilized countries. For the rest, the 999 in every 1,000, 2 or 3 books are permitted at a time, but conditions are such that they cannot always take advantage of this privilege. Writing or the taking of notes of books read are dangerous pastimes in which they must not indulge. This deliberate discouragement of intellectual development is curious and revealing. From the point of view of reclaiming a prisoner and of making him a fit citizen, his mind should be approached and diverted, and he should be made literate and taught some craft. But this point of view has perhaps not struck the prison authorities in India. Certainly it has been conspicuous by its absence in the United Provinces. Recently attempts has been made to teach reading and writing to the boys and young men in prison, but they are wholly ineffective, and the men in charge of them have no competence. Sometimes it is said that convicts are averse to learning. My own experience has been the exact opposite, and I found many of them, who came to me for the purpose, to have a perfect passion for learning to read and write. We used to teach such convicts as came our way, and they worked hard. And sometimes when I woke up in the middle of the night, I was surprised to find 1 or 2 of them sitting by a dim lantern inside their barrack, learning their lessons for the next day. So I occupied myself with my books, going from one type of reading to another, but usually sticking to heavy books. Novels made one feel mentally slack, and I did not read many of them. Sometimes I would weary of too much reading, and then I would take to writing. My historical series of letters to my daughter kept me occupied right through my 2-year term, and they helped me very greatly to keep mentally fit. To some extent I lived through the past I was writing about and almost forgot about my jail surroundings. Travel books were always welcome, records of old travelers, Huyen Tsang and Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta and others, and moderns like Sven Hedin with his journeys across the deserts of Central Asia, and Roerich finding strange adventures in Tibet. Picture books also, especially of mountains and glaciers and deserts, for in prison one hungers for wide spaces and seas and mountains. I had some beautiful picture books of Mont Blanc, the Alps and the Himalayas, and I turned to them often and gazed at the glaciers when the temperature of my cell or barrack was 115 degrees Fahrenheit or even more. An atlas was an exciting affair. It brought all manner of past memories and dreams of places we had visited and places we had wanted to go to, and the longing to go again to those haunts of past days and visit all the other inviting marks and dots that represented great cities, and cross the shaded regions that were mountains, and the blue patches that were seas, and to see the beauties of the world, and watch the struggles and conflicts of a changing humanity. The longing to do all this would seize us and clutch us by the throat, and we would hurriedly and sorrowfully put the atlas by and return to the well-known walls that surrounded us and the dull routine that was our daily lot. End of chapter 44.